right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're so glad you're here. Before we get started, we wanted to note just a few housekeeping points. To avoid background noise, all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We will be addressing questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions as the webinar continues, please enter them into the questions box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen if viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of your screen if viewing from a phone. If you have any comments or concerns during the webinar, please also enter these into the questions box. We will review and address any immediate needs as they occur. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon for the webinar, Focusing Through a Lens of Hope After Decades of Depression and Attempting Suicide, presented by Shannon Heath Parkin. She has received the Transforming Lived Experience Award from the American Association of Suicidology in 2022. She has volunteered with NAMI Montgomery County, Maryland as an In Our Own Voice speaker since 2019 and has co-facilitated more than 100 connection recovery support groups. Shannon's writings have appeared in Washington Post, USA Today, and Speaking of Suicide, an internationally known website dedicated to suicide prevention. She was a keynote speaker at the To Be Continued Suicide Prevention Conference in Minnesota in September of 2022. Shannon co-presented with Reverend Michelle Johns of Silver Spring United Methodist Church on how faith communities can welcome and support suicide attempt survivors at the Maryland Suicide Prevention Conference in 2021. She is working towards becoming a certified peer recovery specialist in Maryland through On Our Own, Frederick County, and NAMI. I will now turn it over to our presenter, Shannon Parkin.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share my recovery story entitled Focusing Through a Lens of Hope After Decades of Depression and Attempting Suicide. Next slide, please. As I describe my recovery journey, you will learn that with support, suicide attempt survivors and all those with mental health challenges can recover fully. To share their stories, providing hope, I will talk today about how my recreational therapist assisted me as I recovered. I will share how faith communities can enable those with mental health challenges. I will describe how the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, trained and supported me to tell my recovery story and facilitate support groups, empowering me to fully celebrate life. Next slide, please. NAMI's In Our Own Voice program teaches volunteers to present their recovery story. Becoming an In Our Own Voice speaker in 2019 provided a springboard for me as I have presented my recovery journey around the country and in published articles. I speak about my personal experience, and nothing I say is intended as medical advice. Each person's recovery path is unique, but I hope what I tell you today will encourage you as you move forward in your own recovery and in supporting those around you. I will be using the In Our Own Voice format as I speak today. I will begin by introducing myself and then describe what happened to me, what helped me, and finish with what is next for me. As I share my story today, I will use some pseudonyms to respect the privacy of those I met during my recovery. Next slide, please. I am the proud mother of 2 children in college. Throughout my life, I've surrounded myself with children's books. I enjoy swimming and walking. I am also active in my faith community, Silver Spring United Methodist Church, where believers, seekers, and doubters of every race, ethnicity, age, ability, socioeconomic status, gender identity, and sexual orientation are fully welcomed and included. I have been a member of this church since 2008. I am incredibly fortunate that my church supported me throughout my mental health challenges. I understand that some people experiencing mental illness have been stigmatized by some faith communities and hope that by sharing my story, more places of worship will be supportive and caring to everyone. Next slide, please. I write and speak about mental health recovery. I advocate for suicide prevention and to reduce stigma for those who face mental health challenges. One of my ministers, who is also a licensed social worker, Reverend Michelle Johns, and I spoke on how faith communities can welcome and support suicide attempt survivors at the Maryland Suicide Prevention Conference in 2021. Two of my essays are posted on Speaking of Suicide, an internationally known suicide prevention website. As a volunteer NAMI Connection Recovery Support Group facilitator, I've co-facilitated over 100 support groups. I am working towards becoming a certified peer recovery specialist in Maryland through Honor in Frederick County, a wellness and recovery center which provides peer support services. NAMI, my doctors, recreational therapists, church community, friends, and families guided me to pull back the smothering blanket of depression and see the light of each day. Today, I will describe how supportive people empowered me to focus my life through a lens of hope. Next slide, please. I had a few challenges growing up, as most people do. Both my natural parents were married 3 times and each struggled with major depression. I was the only child of the middle marriages. Given my complicated family, I joked that I received training in diplomacy from the womb. I moved schools, cities, and sometimes countries and parents every year from 4th through 12th grade. My mother, father, and stepfather were all university professors for more than 40 years each. Looking back now, I know I had depression by my early teens, but told no one. Now I know depression is anger turned inward, but for much of my life, I did not know what depression meant. My older half-brother used to tease me by putting a blanket over my head when we were children. I thought I was being smothered. This happened so often when I was a child that to this day I cannot still wear anything on my head. Fortunately for me, I have thick hair. On the other hand, I know I was privileged as a white middle-class youngster and was never without shelter or food. When I was 17 in 1984, I accidentally fell 25 feet while hiking in the Rockies. Some amazing friends ran down the mountain and called flight for life. Other friends sat with me on the mountainside until the helicopter flew me out to a Boulder hospital. I suffered a traumatic brain injury. I was comatose for about 4 days. I have no memory of my hiking fall or the first 2 weeks afterwards. My mom contacted Bryn Mawr College and delayed my admission a year. During that year of rehabilitation, I had outpatient therapy and attended a junior college. I'd swum competitively through middle school and high school. After my hiking fall, our swimming club coach welcomed me back to the team, even though I was slow and uncoordinated. Gradually, my skills returned and I began to swim competitively. The butterfly became my best stroke. With the hope of becoming a neurologist, I majored in biology, focusing on neurobiology. Unfortunately, despite these grand aspirations, I struggled and often isolated myself to cope. I had difficulty with crowds, needed at least 9 hours of sleep, and could not multitask. I overexercised and developed a pattern of having only 1 meal a day, often in my room. Eating in the crowded dining halls was a real challenge for me. Breathing, talking, and eating with many people around me was more than my brain could handle. Because of my traumatic brain injury and a family history of alcoholism, I avoided alcohol completely. Instead, I became addicted to exercise and undereating as I attempted to control the world around me. I was sent home at the end of my junior year for anorexia. I returned to Bryn Mawr for a final semester and was able to graduate in 1989, majoring in biology and minoring in psychology. However, there was no way I could pursue a medical degree. In 1992, I received my master's in environmental health from the University of Washington. I moved to Maryland in 1993 and began teaching occupational health and safety around the country for a nonprofit. I married in 1996. On the surface, I had made a full recovery, but the reality was different. I still struggled with anorexia and depression. I was asked to resign my job in 1998. I tried teaching at private high schools, but ran into difficulties. Crowds, loud noises, and any situation where I had multiple distractions continued to overwhelm me. When I became pregnant, I began to feel better. My wonderful children were born in 2001 and 2004. I love my kids with all my heart. When they were small, I focused all my energy on them. I drove minimally before the birth of my children, but after I was in 2 accidents, I lived in fear of driving. After my daughter was born, I stopped driving completely. I was unaware of my negligence of matters related to housekeeping, and my cooking skills were minimal. My irregular eating patterns from my college years persisted. My marriage dissolved in 2010. After a couple of years, I was able to get on Social Security disability, but still had severe depression. Next slide, please. In May of 2015, my damaged brain told me to end my life. I walked to the metro station one morning and jumped in front of a train. Every day, I give thanks that I survived and recovered fully. If you or anyone you know has suicidal thoughts, I urge you to call, chat, or text the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 988. I recovered in part due to one of our ministers who taught me to breathe and be gentle with myself. So now I encourage you to breathe and be gentle with yourself. Rescuers and doctors saved my life. I suffered multiple broken bones and another injury to my brain. Doctors had to amputate the front portion of both my feet. I have no memory of my suicide attempt or the first 6 weeks afterwards. The fact that I attempted suicide was indeed a day when I saw no light, a black day for me. So that is why the text of most of this slide is black. But the fact that I survived is one of hope. And that is why almost all my other slides are royal blue, a color for me signifying an opportunity to focus through a lens of hope and celebrate life. 988 is a wonderful lifeline for all those with suicidal thoughts. Next slide, please. During the first days of my hospitalization, my friend of 30 years, Marita, sat beside my bed singing, "It is well with my soul." Very appropriately, their father took full custody of our children. A member of my church, whom I will call Olivia, was on the train I jumped in front of. Olivia went to church that Sunday morning and offered prayers for the woman who had been struck without knowing it was me. Reverend Michelle led the prayers that morning. My first memory is when our lead pastor and a friend brought my daughter, who had just turned 14 years old, to see me in the hospital 6 weeks after my suicide attempt. Through the unconditional love in my daughter's eyes, I began to see hope offered by the world. I spent 6 months in the hospital, including 4 months on the behavioral health unit, where I learned to walk again on my remaining half right foot and 3/4 of a left. Doctors found the right combination of antidepressants for me. After my hospital stay, I moved into the first of several assisted living facilities, where I resided for 5 years. At a local medical clinic, I began electroconvulsive therapy that I continued for more than a year. At each session, electrodes were taped to my forehead. I received an anesthesia, so I was sedated while my brain was electrically stimulated. Nurses held my hands as they placed the IV and stood beside me with smiling faces when I woke at the end of each session. I did present a challenge to them, as the usual way to determine responsiveness under a sedative is monitoring the toes. This was not possible in my case, as I have only partial feet, but those nurses adapted and never lost their ability to smile, encouraging me to do the same. Next slide, please. While I was still hospitalized, my friend Ellen called the helpline of NAMI, Montgomery County in Maryland. With NAMI's help, I connected with a group of therapists who travel their clients. They drive and accompany their clients to meetings, sessions, or places we need to go as we move forward in our recovery. This was crucial for me because I do not drive and at the time could not go anywhere independently. I met Debbie, a recreational therapist with 40 years of experience. Through her, I learned that recreational therapy enables people to recover through activities they enjoy. When Debbie asked me when I had found moments of joy in my life, I told her that after months of hospitalizations, I just longed to be outside. I asked if we could go on walks in local parks during time together. At the time, I was not allowed to leave the facility where I resided alone, so Debbie and I conversed and learned about each other as we strolled on neighboring paths. As I became more comfortable with her, I recall one of the first times we laughed together was when we agreed I needed to walk like a duck to maintain my balance on my partial feet. We also agreed that while I would miss wearing flip-flops, I was glad I would never again be asked to put on a pair of high heels. Debbie encouraged me to return to reading children's books that I have shared throughout my life. She helped me enroll in the training class offered through the Literacy Council to teach adults how to read. For more than a year, I met weekly with an Egyptian woman, teaching her how to read picture books that she then read with her grandchildren. When I told Debbie that I had swum competitively in high school and college, she took me to the local pool. I was not afraid of the water since I spent so much time in pools during my younger years, but I was concerned about what people would say when they saw my partial feet. I still remember Debbie's hand on my back as she steered me into the locker room for the first time since my suicide attempt. I was met with the familiar smell of chlorine and began to relax. For a few times at the pool, I soon realized people rarely mentioned my feet. They may have stared, but given that my eyesight is poor without my glasses, I did not notice. I was just happy to be in a swimming pool where my feet mattered little. Next slide, please. Living in assisted living facilities for almost 5 years, I learned from my fellow residents. I recall one morning waking up feeling sad, as I often did early in my recovery. I wandered out to the dining room. A 9-year-old woman, whom I will call Gloria, who lived in the room beside me, sat alone at the dining room table in her wheelchair. Her kind eyes reminded me of her former housekeeper, who was a large part of my childhood growing up in the 1970s in South Carolina. I kissed Gloria gently on the forehead and said, "I love you." Gloria turned to me with steady, kind gaze and said clearly, "I love you too." Those were the only words I heard Gloria speak in the 18 months I knew her before she passed away in her sleep one night. Her family told me she had been a high school counselor in Washington, D.C. for much of her life. She counseled me that morning with her kindness. In assisted living, the caregivers were so overworked, handling all the laundry was a real challenge. I often washed my clothes in the shower. I recall one morning feeling sorry for myself as I stepped into the shower after wringing the water out of my laundry. I heard the woman who lived across the hall from me, whom I will call Dee, yelling, "Help me." Dee was a retired lawyer and a Howard University graduate with multiple sclerosis who was wheelchair bound. She had dropped her TV remote control and could not reach it from a wheelchair. I picked up the device, handed it to her, and kissed her forehead, wishing her good morning. Smiling at me, she exclaimed her favorite 3 words, "Keep hope alive." As I left the room, I saw our drawers overflow. The caregivers had no time to fold their clothes. By the next morning, my lens had shifted. I realized that being able to wash my own clothes while standing in the shower was indeed a privilege. I found satisfaction in neatly folding my clothes into my drawers. I enjoyed talking with Dee as I organized her clothes under her direction. Early in my recovery, I attended some meetings of people who had experienced traumatic brain injuries. I recall at one meeting sitting across the table from a nonverbal young man who was wheelchair bound. I had given a long-winded description of an incident at the assisted living facilities. The young man responded concisely to the talking board strapped to his chair with words I still have taped to my wall 5 years later. It takes time to smell the roses. This brave man, who on the surface seemed so disabled, taught me an incredible lesson that day about the importance of relishing each moment of life to appreciate every joy the world offers. Next slide, please. In the years since my suicide attempt, my faith community, Silver Spring United Methodist Church, has been wonderfully supportive. During the months when I was in the hospital and the 5 years I resided in assisted living, one church member sent me cards on every holiday, even St. Patrick's Day. Those old-fashioned cards with real stamps meant so much to me. I recall one Sunday morning in early 2017 standing in the chapel after a service. feeling rather confused because I was having electroconvulsive therapy twice a week at the time. Our lead pastor then looked at me directly and said, "Shannon, you will always have a home here." I became friends with an older couple who joined the church with me at the same time I did. Over time, I began calling them mom and dad because I saw them as my church parents. They visited me every week throughout my 6-month hospital stay, including the 4 months on the behavioral health unit. This wonderful couple also supported me throughout my 5 years residing in assisted living facilities, even helping me move when I was transferred from one facility to another. These consistent, caring relationships enabled me to see a hopeful future. At one church service, my church mom said to me gently, "Your shoe is untied. Would you like me to tie it for you?" I was so proud to be wearing real tennis shoes instead of the brace up to my knee that I'd worn before that week. I'd forgotten that tennis shoes need to be tied to be effective. But my church mom was there to remind me. Silver Spring United Methodist Church also provided a place where I saw my children weekly. My relationship with them grew as my recovery progressed, as is exemplified in these 2 anecdotes. Next slide, please. One Sunday at church, I was reading The Little Blue Engine That Could by Watty Piper with preschool children, while my daughter, then 16 years old, sat behind me with one arm draped over my shoulder. With her other hand, my daughter reached to the end of my right shoe. As I read the story of the little engine that made it over the mountain because the dolls and toys cheered her on and gave her confidence, my daughter squeezed repeatedly the empty toe of my right tennis shoe. She leaned into me as I read the story. My right forearm has significant scarring from the injuries I sustained from my suicide attempt. On my right elbow is a skin graft that appears as an extra patch of skin. I recall while in the hospital in a group session on the behavioral health unit, another patient refused to sit beside me because she said she did not want to, quote, catch no tumor, referring to my right elbow. After that incident, I asked if the skin graft could be removed, but was told Medicare would not pay for such cosmetic surgery. In the first 3 years after my suicide attempt, I always wore long sleeves when I was around my children, so they would not see my scarring. In May of 2018, on a warm day I asked in the church, first my daughter and then her younger brother, if it would be okay if I wore short sleeves around them. They each told me they were ready to see my scars. About 3 months later, my daughter, then 17, sat to the right of me in a church meeting. For the first 15 minutes of the meeting, she massaged the extra skin on my right elbow. At the end of the meeting, she turned to me and said, "Mom, it is okay. You have a wiggly elbow." I knew then that I would never again consider having my wiggly elbow removed, for it is a constant reminder how life embraced me, pulling me back from the edge my mental illness had taken me. Next slide, please. In April of 2018, my psychiatrist told me he thought I was ready to ride the metro again, but he wanted me to ride with my recreational therapist, Debbie, at first. I rode with her weekly for a month before I was given approval to ride independently. I used specific imagery to overcome my fears. Next slide, please. By coincidence, on that first ride, Debbie and I both wore on t-shirts. When we reached the platform, I looked at Debbie's face down at the tracks as the train pulled into the station. Debbie took my hand and we boarded the train. We'd agreed we would ride only one stop before turning around and returning. We found a seat close to the door because my partial feet didn't give me the bounce needed to stand on a moving train. At the next station, my confidence rocketed when the door opened. As we stepped off the train, I reached my hand back for Debbie. She said, let me just switch my bag to the other shoulder so I don't trip you. I joked with her by saying, yeah, that would not be something you'd want to put on your resume. We laughed together standing on the metro platform. I still focused on Debbie's face as I heard our returning train approach the station. But this time I didn't have to fight the urge to cover my ears. Next slide, please. Debbie and I rode the metro together every week for the next month. On our third trip together, as we stood on the platform, I told Debbie about the phone conversation I had had the previous night with my daughter. That it ended when my daughter and I had shared the words, I love you very much. At that same moment, I saw a mother bidding goodbye to her own daughter, a toddler in a stroller, by making a heart shape with her fingers. By focusing on the paired image of the heart-shaped fingers and the echo of my own daughter's words, I love you very much too, Mom. I was able to watch the train arrive at the station with a smile on my face, something I had previously never dreamed possible. By using that same imagery on our next trip, I found I could watch the train arrive at the station without fear. 2 weeks later, in May of 2018, my psychiatrist gave his full approval for me to ride the metro independently. I happily shared the news with my church family as I sat with Olivia, who had been on the train I stepped in front of in 2015, and my church parents. 2 months after I began riding the metro independently, I learned Olivia would be leading a group from our church to go to a baseball game. The group would be riding together on the metro. I wanted to go, but I was worried my presence on the train would cause church members to be uncomfortable. Very tentatively, I asked Olivia if I could join the group. Without a moment's hesitation, she said, definitely. I've got your back, always have, always will. With those words and a successful trip to the ball game, I knew I never had and never would walk alone. Next slide, please. I will always remember the first time I heard an NRO voice speaker share how they recovered after decades of mental illness and attempting suicide. That day, my eyes opened to the possibility that I may one day progress far enough in my recovery to share my story. Having lived with depression for 40 years, my mental illness has always been like the smothering blanket my brother used to put over my head when I was a child, limiting my ability to breathe freely. The stigma and shame of being a suicide attempt survivor with a disabling injury was an additional heavier blanket on top of me. Hearing that man describe his recovery journey, I felt the smothering blanket of my mental illness was lifted, allowing me to breathe more freely. In January of 2019, I completed the training to become an NRO voice speaker. Those NAMI trainers encouraged me that I could still share my story, despite my obvious speech deficits from my traumatic brain injuries. I wanted to share my journey to enable others to breathe more easily into their own recovery journeys. Through NRO voice, I found a sense of purpose. Next slide, please. I would like to take a moment now to recommend the book, Healing, Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health by Dr. Thomas Insel, the former director of the National Institute for Mental Health. Dr. Insel describes how recovery happens through connecting with people, finding places to build those relationships, and discovering one's purpose. The 3 P's of prevention: people, place, purpose. Through NRO voice, I share anecdotes describing the people I connected with, the places where I developed those relationships, and the purpose I gained through sharing my recovery journey. By coincidence, I was scheduled to give an NRO voice presentation on the 4th anniversary of the day I jumped in front of a train. I was on my way to meet 2 other NAMI speakers with whom I would be presenting at a senior communion. I climbed onto the public bus and as usual had difficulty keeping my balance because of my partial feet as I looked for an open seat. I confess I was feeling sorry for myself when I sat down. Once seated, I watched a woman board the bus. She used the front pole beside the driver to pull herself up the steps, then swiveled her body into the front seat with the grace of a dancer. She thanked the bystander for lifting her wheelchair onto the bus behind her. It was then that I noticed her left pant leg was empty. In that moment, I became grateful for the feet I have. By the time I arrived at the senior center, I was no longer feeling sorry for myself and was ready to speak. After all 3 of us had shared our experiences, an older man sitting in the audience raised his hand. He thanked me for sharing my story, saying that his wife, who was sitting beside him, had jumped in front of a train when she was 16 years old. Given their age, this incident must have taken place at least 60 years ago. After the talk, I went up and spoke to the couple. I asked the woman if I could give her a hug. She nodded. We wrapped our arms around each other in silence and exchanged more than words could have expressed. Next slide, please. The first time my children saw my partial bare feet was 4 years after my suicide attempt. We were swimming together at a friend's neighborhood pool. In the bright sunshine of the day, each of us climbed in the water and began to swim and splash. After about 20 minutes, my 18-year-old daughter sank beneath the water in front of me. I stood in the shallow end talking with my friend and my 15-year-old son. After about 10 seconds underwater, my daughter reappeared and said, "Mom, this is the first time we've seen your feet." I asked her and my son if they had any questions. My son asked me, "Mom, can you still do the butterfly stroke?" I'd swum the stroke previously, but said I fummed my kids. I said the butterfly was more difficult because the dolphin kick really requires toes, but I'd give it a try. I swam the length of the pool and back, doing a passable butterfly, although probably not competitively legal. My daughter said, "Mom, I'm proud of you." My son said, "So am I, Mom. You're pretty cool." Next slide, please. This is a picture of my reading the delightful picture book, You Are Here for a Reason, by Nancy Tillman. I will always remember reading this book with a group of children while my daughter stood beside me. I quote the beautiful opening lines here. "You're here for a reason. You certainly are. The world would be different without you by far. If not for your hands and your eyes and your feet, the world, like a puzzle, would be incomplete." The following anecdote occurred when I was reading in a neighborhood bookstore where I read regularly with small children. A girl sitting in her mother's lap asked me to read a finger puppet book about a little puppy. Both she and another little girl listening with her mother were about 4 years old, so I asked if they would like to control the puppet with the fingers while I read. The little girl who had asked for the book, whom I will call Emma, removed her hands from underneath her mother's arms and said, "I can't do that." All of her fingers ended at the first knuckle, and her thumbs were also abbreviated. I encouraged her to act out the part of the puppy while I read. She joined in with enthusiasm, making barking sounds as I read to the 2 girls. After I finished reading, Emma's mother walked over to one of the bookshelves. I approached her and asked if it would be helpful for her daughter to feel the empty part of the front of my shoes, telling her I had partial feet. Her mother told me that Emma also had abbreviated feet and had multiple surgeries to correct this anomaly the little girl had had since birth. Her daughter was due to have another surgery the following month. Though I was trying to talk quietly with Emma's mother, the little girl seemed to know exactly what we were saying. She walked over to us, sat down on the floor, and began taking off her shoes, glancing only briefly at her mother, who nodded. Emma took off her shoes to show her short, sock-covered feet. Emma asked me to show her my feet. The other little girl sitting in her mother's lap, what was happening? I looked at both mothers, and when they nodded their approval, I took my shoes off. Emma appeared fascinated that my feet were also short. and she took off her socks. Emma then asked me to take off my socks. I looked at both mothers and they nodded. I took off my socks. Emma said, "Gross, you do not have any toes." I looked at Emma and said, "That's okay. My feet work for me, just like your feet work for you." Both of us then put our shoes and socks back on, and the mother of the other little girl told her daughter, "Everybody is different." When Emma went to play in the little tent in the story corner, her mother apologized for what she had said, saying that her daughter was repeating what other children had told her. I told her that I understood and I thought it was natural her daughter repeated what she'd heard from others. I wanted Emma to know that I was all right with my partial feet. Before they left, Emma showed me tricks she could do with a little Nerf soccer ball, and we began kicking the soft soccer ball back and forth. I wish mother and daughter the best with Emma's next surgery as I left the bookstore. Next slide, please. During the first 2 months of the pandemic, I still resided in assisted livings. For 2 months, I was told to stay in my small suite consisting of a bedroom, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom. I was more anxious than ever to move and live independently in my own apartment, but my psychiatrist had to approve the plan. I spent the first month feeling very discouraged. But then I realized I could choose to remain unhappy or choose to find the positive, even in these difficult circumstances. I thought about what I had learned in my earlier years in assisted living from my fellow residents who rarely left the building. I resolved to focus on celebrating life. I began keeping a daily gratitude log that I learned about through the support groups and the volunteer work I did with NAMI. In this gratitude log, I kept track of every phone call or online interaction I had with my children, friends, and church members. I was grateful for my church friends who dropped off groceries for me weekly. I wrote of the joy of looking out my window and seeing a bird flying with wings stretched wide. During the early months of the pandemic, Reverend Michelle called me every week. In one phone conversation, as I described my gratitude journal in detail, Reverend Michelle appeared unusually quiet. I asked her why. She replied she didn't want to interrupt me. I told her, "Please don't worry about interrupting me. I think you know there's no way you can step on my toes." We laughed together. This conversation was one of many examples of caring people supporting me as I learned to find humor in my situation. I recall one friend, a math tutor, who encouraged me to walk on my own 2 feet. This friend had seen my partial feet and helped me find a shoe specialist. I asked my friend, "How much is 1/2 3/4?" My wise friend replied, 1 1/4. Then you need to find your own answer. Caring people who talk and laugh with me empower me and realize that 1/2 + 3/4 will always equal infinity for me, pandemic or not. In October of 2020, after 5 years of residing in assisted living facilities, I was given approval by my psychiatrist and therapist to move into my own apartment. Church members helped me move. Reverend Michelle gave me a wooden plaque that reads, "The best is yet to come." I strive to live up to these words each day, envisioning a future of light and laughter. 2.5 years have passed since I moved into my own apartment. I continued to keep my gratitude journal. Initially, I started it only to prove I could live it on my own. Now maintaining this log is as much a daily practice for me as is taking my antidepressant medications. This month, I will write date 1100 in my gratitude log. One of the things I'm thankful for is this journal itself. It gives me the opportunity to chronicle the gifts I receive and the lessons I learn as I work through challenges. Next slide, please. In September of 2021, my church mom passed away from cancer. When I heard the news, I wept and then went for a walk. I felt the wind against my face and heard nesting chirping. I saw a bird soaring across the sky. I felt my church mom's presence with me. I reflected on how she taught me that although I cannot change my past, I can shift the lens I use to look at what has happened. learning for both my regrets and joys. The memory of her words guides me to move beyond my past mental health struggles, to stride forward, celebrating life, always learning. I know I can best honor her by living fully, allowing love to erase my previous fears, and sharing the hope of the universe. I have been asked how I cope with any shame I feel about my previous actions caused by my mental illness. Of course, I regret that major depression caused me to jump in front of a train. Today, however, I have tremendous gratitude for the support I have. My therapist, church, and friends have taught me to learn from my past. Through their words, I realize that any shame I may have is essentially a prison of my own design. The care of my supporters empowers me to build bridges to a better tomorrow. I know I live with depression. Despite this illness, I have also been given gifts. My depression has been in full remission since 2018. I'm grateful that I'm alive and I'm able to walk. I'm fortunate that I have people who care deeply for me and help me stay focused on moving forward. I know how to care for myself and keep my depression in remission through coping strategies. I must take my medication and check in regularly with my psychiatrist and therapist. I must eat healthy food and exercise a moderate amount. I need to sleep at least 9 hours each night. I know when I'm feeling down, I need to take a walk outside and see birds soaring in the sky. I know whom to call to talk with people who will truly listen to me. I process the past with my therapists, ministers, and in NAMI support groups. I am fortunate to talk regularly with people who encourage me to remain focused on the sunshine of life. My supporters have helped me shift from asking, why me, to what can I do today and tomorrow. I've learned that even though I'm alone much of the time, I don't need to be lonely. When I asked my children if they had any questions in the swimming pool when they saw my partial feet, my teenage son simply asked me if I could still swim butterfly. In that question, he taught me a very important lesson about focusing my energies on what I can do now and in the future, not on the toes I lack or the past. Through NAMI and in my suicide prevention work, I've met others who have attempted suicide and recovered. Previously, I had never known such people existed. Some of the suicide attempt survivors I've met through co-facilitating NAMI support groups. One woman described how, with the help of her therapist, she reframed the anniversary of her suicide attempt. Instead of remembering the moment when depression almost killed her, she chose to view that day as one when life fully embraced her, pulling her back from the edge to which her mental illness had taken her. Next slide, please. I will spend the rest of my life sharing my recovery story and encouraging others to share their recovery journeys. I know my recovery happened not because of who I am, but because of the people and organizations that supported me. As I share my story, I want to be a light of hope for my own children, as well as all those who face mental health challenges. By sharing how I supported, I want to encourage people to care for those in their communities. Next slide, please. I want to recommend the book, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, What Families, Friends, and Partners Can Say and Do by Dr. Stacy Friedenthal. This book is an extraordinarily valuable resource for the millions who have loved ones with suicidal thoughts. Dr. Friedenthal is a beautiful writer who conveys practical advice, which is a gift to anyone seeking to offer hope to those with suicidal thoughts. Dr. Friedenthal's experience as an attempt survivor, a concerned parent, a clinician, a journalist, and an associate professor who teaches suicide prevention adds depth and insight to her writing. I wish a copy of this book could be given to the families and friends of each person who has attempted suicide or has been hospitalized for suicidal thoughts. Next slide, please. There were more than 48,000 deaths by suicide in the US in 2021. For every death by suicide, there are 25 attempts. There were more than 1,200,000 suicide attempts in the US in 2021. Next slide, please. Although a previous suicide attempt is a risk factor for suicide, 90% of suicide attempt survivors do not die by suicide. Next slide, please. For every person that dies by suicide, 316 people consider suicide but do not kill themselves. Stories of hope and recovery have the power to help others and dispel stigma and myths about suicide through the Papageno Effect. In Mozart's 18th century opera, The Magic Flute, one of the main characters, Papageno, loses life and feels initially the only way out of his pain is through suicide. Before he can act on that feeling, three characters show him other ways to solve his problem. Named after this story, the Papageno Effect is the influence the mass media can have by responsibly reporting on suicide and presenting non-suicide alternatives to crisis. On an individual level, each and every recovery story has a power to save lives. The numbers show there are millions who have attempted suicide and have seriously considered suicide, but have found hope and gone on to live out their lives fully. These stories need to be shared. We need to hear and read recovery stories from people of every race, ethnicity, age, ability, socioeconomic status, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Next slide, please. On Easter Sunday, 2022, Reverend Michelle announced from the pulpit as I sat beside Olivia, who had been on the train I stepped in front of in 2015, that I won a national award for sharing my mental health recovery story. I traveled to Chicago to receive the Transforming Lived Experience Award from the American Association of Suicidology at their conference. Last September, I traveled to Minnesota to give the keynote presentation at the To Be Continued Suicide Prevention Conference. As I walked back to my hotel in Minnesota, I crossed railroad tracks. I reflected that I have never walked alone. The philosophy of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. As Dr. Ken Duckworth, Chief Medical Officer of NAMI, describes in this book, you are not alone. I walk each day on my partial feet, knowing I matter because of the support of NAMI, Silver Spring United Methodist Church, Honor in Frederick County, and my doctors, therapists, friends, and family. Next slide, please. I spent decades never knowing anyone could recover after a suicide attempt or get over suicidal ideation. I know many of you have your own mental health recovery stories. We need you to talk and write about your recovery. I found my lens of hope and grace and know you will too. Resilience is built through community. With each story, hope grows exponentially. Believe in your recovery and shout it out. Final slide, please. You will see my contact information on this slide. Email is the best way to reach me. Please contact me if you'd be interested in my sharing my recovery story or encouraging others to share their recovery story with others in your community. Thank you for listening to me. We now have time for questions.
All right. Thank you, Shannon, for sharing with us. That was truly wonderful and inspirational. We will now open it up for questions and answers. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen.
Did any questions come in during the while I was speaking?
Let me check. I do not see any questions just yet, but we could give them a couple of minutes. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
We have a comment. It says, thank you so very much for sharing your story, Jane from Michigan. And we have another one, no questions, just want to express gratitude to Shannon. Thank you for sharing your story. Okay, here's the question. Do you think your TBI precipitated your mental illness?
Thank you for your question. The TBI was part of it. I also have a family history of mental illness. And so that was the TBI, I think, contributed to it, but it was a combination of factors. And I think one of the things that I mean, as I shared in my story, I didn't come to terms with my own limitations from my traumatic brain injury until like the last 4 years during my recovery from my suicide attempt in 2015. And I really tried to ignore my limitations for decades and develop some very, the anorexia and I really tried to push too hard, and I didn't come to terms with my own limitations. And so one thing that has really helped me is learning what I can do, learning how to say no, and also learning, that I need to take breaks and I need to take care of myself.
Okay. I think we have another comment. Shannon, thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your story. I am a NAMI NR voice presenter with suicide attempts. We have a question. Do you think that the pandemic created an increase to suicide?
Well, it's the pandemic. I mean, there have been different, I know that based on the numbers from what I understand, I mean, one thing that I don't necessarily keep track of is all the numbers and whatnot. I believe that the numbers of deaths by suicide in 2020 dropped somewhat, but then they've increased back up in 2021. The number of deaths due to substance use disorders, I think, greatly increased during the pandemic. So, and the numbers with suicide, the number of suicides really, that's a whole field in and of itself. So I really go by the CDC and the numbers that are presented through the American Federation of Suicide Prevention and the Suicide Awareness Voices of Education, SAVE. SAVE is what I referenced when I gave the numbers from 2021 in my presentation.
Okay. Thank you.
That's the best I can. That's the best sort of answer I can have given my expertise. I mean, I don't know all the specifics of it. So, but thank you for your question. I'm sorry.
We have another one. I work with a lot of foster youth with SI. How can we help them? And how can we help foster parents deal with the use and or not be intimidated by the implications?
Okay, you work with a lot of foster youth who have attempted suicide or have substance use?
She said SI, so I believe that's suicide ideation.
Okay, you've worked with a lot of suicide. There are two. I really recommend Dr. Friedenthal's book, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. And it's in my slides, and you'll get that in the recording and whatnot. And I also recommend Dr. Friedenthal's website. The website, Speaking of Suicide. I was very fortunate in that Dr. Friedenthal posted 2 of my essays, but she has like I don't know she has like she's been keeping that website for a decade, and she has many, many essays on there about suicide. And she's a suicide prevention counselor. She wrote a book a couple of years ago about dealing with suicide, about suicide for tips and techniques for professionals. But I would really recommend this book and her earlier book. And looking at the website, speakingofsuicide.com.
Right, thank you.
But thank you for your work in helping foster youth with suicidal ideation and whatnot. That is incredibly brave work, and I'm grateful for you.
All right, we have another question. Do you have any feelings of hopelessness in spite of being on medication?
Do I have any feelings of hopelessness? I at this time, that when I get discouraged, and I get discouraged just like everybody else, I wouldn't call it hopelessness, but when I get discouraged or feeling down, I use coping techniques. I go for a walk outside. I reach out to my therapist and minister, and I write. I listen to audiobooks of middle grade fiction, and that's. I mean, I don't watch TV, but that's my release, and so that has been very helpful to me. I think the other thing that really helped me was the electroconvulsive therapy, as well as the medication and the support of my recreational therapist.
All right. Have you heard of Kevin Hines' story of jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge and regretting it milliseconds after he jumped off?
Yes, I'm very familiar with Kevin Hines' story, and I've seen a couple of his films and I've read his book, Cracked Not Broken. Kevin Hines is probably the most famous suicide attempt survivor, and I greatly admire his work and his ability. I mean, he speaks internationally about dealing with bipolar and living with bipolar and working and his suicide prevention work.
And we had just a couple more comments. Miss Shannon, thanks for this excellent presentation from Pastor Saunders. And the last one is, thanks, just celebrated 44 years of foster care work.
That's very brave.
Yep, so that's all our questions. So thank you so much, Shannon, for sharing your experience and telling your story with us. We appreciate you for doing so. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thanks everybody. And remember what DOIs used to say, keep hope alive, always. Hope, hope, hope. It's out there. Believe in it and share your story.